I'm Paul Levinson, and welcome to Light On, Light Through, episode 368, Tetrads for History and Alternate History. Well, those of you who've been listening to this podcast over the years know that I work very closely with Marshall McLuhan, the great media theorist in the late 1970s. And one of the last things that McLuhan did in his great career is come up with a tool, as he liked to put it, that he called the Tetrad. And I thought I would devote this podcast to the application of the Tetrad for history and alternate history. Now, McLuhan's Tetrad is very useful for discovering and understanding how human activities, especially media, are all interconnected to one another. The Tetrad maps out a four-part relationship that occurs in any human endeavor. That activity amplifies or enhances an aspect or certain aspects of human life. As it does this, it obsolesces an activity that had previously been amplified. And the human activity also retrieves an activity that had been previously obsolesced or pushed off center stage. And finally, the amplified activity reverses or flips into a new activity, at once very different from, but also very closely related to what was amplified in the first place. So those are the four parts of the Tetrad: amplification, obsolescence, retrieval, and reversal. And here are some examples before we get to the alternate history. Radio amplifies sound and speech heard instantly across great distances. That's what listening to the radio is, and usually this speech is for the purpose of providing news, entertainment, broadcasting live a sporting event, that kind of thing. Radio obsolesces slower visual media such as newspapers and books. Radio retrieves word of mouth, in-person singing, which I do a lot of. You occasionally hear me even singing a couple of bars on this podcast. And radio also retrieves oral history. Very important. For example, the Vikings let the world know about their discovery of the New World through sagas, oral history, and it wasn't taken that seriously. It wasn't until Columbus sailed across the ocean, got here, and his report of his getting to America was actually written up by his son Diego, which became a best-selling book in that era in Europe. So it took words in print to really start the age of discovery. But back to radio, it reverses, the fourth part of the Tetrad, it reverses into television, which many people consider radio with pictures, which it is. And television, in turn, amplifies the audio-visual sent instantly across great distances. Television obsolesces radio as a source of drama and comedy. Television retrieves cave painting, and for that matter, all painting, as well as motion pictures and all forms of writing. And television reverses into, well, the internet, smartphones, and holography. And obviously, we're all using a lot of the internet and smartphones these days, not quite so much holography. That part of the reversal of television has yet to completely happen. But as should be clear from those two tetrads for radio and for television, tetrads move through history in cycles, Or, as I put it back in the 1970s and more recently in several articles, tetrads progress in wheels or spirals. And in the show notes to this episode, you'll find links to various articles that I've written about this. And by the way, they'll all be free for you to read. Now, what does all this have to do with alternate history? Well, I've been thinking a lot about alternate history these days. Again, as some of you may recall, I've talked about various alternate history books and television shows in some of these recent episodes of Light On, Light Through. And in fact, I've been writing alternate history. My short story, It's Real Life, is an alternate history story about the Beatles, a world in which John Lennon was not tragically assassinated. And last week, I had a great conversation with Chuck Todd on his podcast, which he's cleverly named the Chuck Toddcast. And in that conversation that I had, I mentioned that in order for an alternate history scenario to be really plausible, the elements of that scenario must be as close as possible to real history. That is, everything other than the element of history that you're changing in your alternate history scenario. And I realized shortly after that conversation that there was a tetratic relationship between history and alternate history. So here's how I see that. Here's a tetrad for history. It amplifies the past as accurately as we can know it. History obsolesces the daily news and our usual focus on the here and now. History retrieves myth, legend, religion, and non-scholarly accounts of the past. And history reverses into alternate history, changing a key element of the past for both entertainment or fiction and a better understanding of, quote, real, unquote, history. And I always put the real part of real history in quotes because even real history is never the entire story. The story may leave things out, emphasize certain things that seem especially important to the historians. No one except the people who actually lived through it know what a scene in real history actually and completely was. But let's get to a tetrad for alternate history. Alternate history amplifies a fictitious better or worse world, obtained by changing a crucial element of history. For example, the man in the high castle imagines a world in which Germany and Japan won the Second World War. That, of course, was the story in the novel published in the 1960s by Philip K. Dick, won the Hugo Award, a brilliant novel, and it was made into a wonderful television series that was on Amazon Prime Video for a good few years in the previous decade. I think from about 2013 to about, 2020. By the way, it starred Rufus Sewell, and I had a great interview with Rufus Sewell, and you can actually see the video of that or listen to it on this podcast, and I will have a link to those interviews, the audio and the video interview with the star Rufus Sewell of The Man in the High Castle. Those links will be in the show notes. So that's an example of what alternate history amplifies. It obsolesces our immersion in the present and our view that the world we're living in now was somehow inevitable, that it had to be that way. When you change an element in history and show how different the history would have been, that contradicts a view that somehow it was always meant or destined to be the way it is now. Alternate history retrieves the notion that most of us had when we were kids, little children, that we could change something just by wanting it. So if we wanted a world in which John F. Kennedy was not assassinated, well, we could write an alternate history about that. And this, of course, is a favorite topic of alternate histories. There are all kinds of great stories and novels, and Stephen King had a both novel that was made into a television series about a time traveler who was trying to stop the assassination of John F. Kennedy. By the way, the alternate reality that is so much fun and I think so fascinating to consider often is brought into being by a traveler from the future who goes to the past and tries to change something, like prevent the assassination of JFK. So, the alternate reality retrieves that wonderful notion, I think, which children have and is often lost in adults, that maybe we can change something just by wanting it to be changed. And the alternate reality reverses into, and this is surprising, but I would say it is important. Recently, there was an article in the New York Times that said that the Webb telescope has indicated that it could be possible that indeed our universe may be just one universe in a, quote, multiverse, unquote. That quote comes from the New York Times. So maybe alternate realities reverse into real alternate realities, from fiction to alternate universes that actually exist. And as I mentioned before, in the show notes, I'll have links to a bunch of articles on the Tetrad and also some further reading about alternate history, including the interview I did with Jack Dan on this very podcast just a few months ago about a wonderful book he wrote, A Fiction Writer's Guide to Alternate History. And I'll have much more in the show notes as well.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
And I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode of Light on Light Through, Tetrads for History and Alternate History. I will be back here next week, probably with a review of, I think that the Who Killed JFK podcast will have posted its final episode, its 10th episode, by next week. And if it does, assuming there isn't an 11th or 12th episode, I'll come back here next week with my final review of that superb podcast. Talk about alternate histories. Wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a world in which that podcast was not necessary? And in the weeks ahead, I'll be reviewing all kinds of other, usually great science fiction shows that have either come on the air or will be coming on the air in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sound, and keep doing whatever you can to help the brave people of Israel and Ukraine fight off the terrorists and fascists that have invaded their countries.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Athens, 2042 AD. She ripped the paper in half, then ripped the halves, then ripped what was left again into bits and pieces of history that could have been. Sierra Waters had read once that, years ago, it was thought that men made love for the thrill, while women made love for the sense of connection it gave them.
Curled Up with a Good Book says, Sierra Waters is sexy as hell. You can find out more about The Plot to Save Socrates by Paul Levinson at theplottosavesocrates.com.
Paul Levinson spills code about an ancient biotech war raging on in secret for centuries.